Good afternoon, Peter and Archie. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we're awaiting the President and two other colleagues who are joining us in the room. And we're running pretty tight because we've got votes upcoming at 4:45, and we'll try and conclude this session before we have to go to vote. So I'm going to ask you very briefly to introduce yourselves for the camera once we start, but go straight into questions.
Yes, please. Yes.
Good afternoon, Alok. We've just decided that we're expecting to conclude the session just before votes at 4:45. So I think there may be more than one, and it's unreasonable, I think, to expect everyone to reassemble. So we'll crack up straight on with it if you're okay with that. Great. So I'll just do a quick countdown. 5, 4. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Select Committee on COP26. We have in front of us today the President of COP26, Alok Sharma, and I'd like him briefly to introduce his team before us today.
Great, thank you, Mr. Dunn. I think on screen you've got Peter Hale, who's Chief Executive of COP26, and Archie Young, who's the lead negotiator. On my right, I've got Alison Campbell, who's the Deputy Lead Negotiator, and on my left, Matt Toombs, who's responsible for the engagement we've done across finance, across our various campaigns, across business and civil society.
Thank you very much. Well, you're all very welcome. And I'd just like to start by saying that this committee was set up by Parliament to provide a forum for a number of select committees to be able to hold you and your team to account for delivery of COP26. And we have guests here today who will be asking you questions from half a dozen select committees, so they're all very welcome. As COP President, you remain in post until the Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 in November. We have just decided at a pre-meeting before you joined us that we think it's appropriate that you should continue to be held to account to Parliament during that period, and by your nodding you seem to indicate that you would welcome that, and we would like you to confirm to us, if you would today, that you'd be willing to appear before a similar convened session perhaps a couple of times this year in the run-up to November 22.
Chair, yes, I would be very happy to come back. We have our presidency here. Obviously, we've got a whole range of commitments which we want to see delivered during this coming year, so I think it's right and proper that you hold us to account.
Excellent. Well, that's a very good start to our session. Can you then give us an indication of what your key priorities are for driving the agenda forward to Sharm el-Sheikh?
Chair, as you know, we got a significant number of commitments from countries at COP26. I do believe it was a historic agreement, and if I go through some of the key elements of that, firstly, in terms of emissions reductions, we've got a commitment that all countries will, if required, come back by the end of 2022 in terms of their 2030 emission reduction targets, to see whether that aligned with the Paris temperature goals. Obviously, there's a big piece of work to be done on that. In terms of finance, obviously we had a delivery plan which set out our expectation that 100 billion would be delivered by 2023 at the latest. There is an expectation to see whether that might come forward to 2022, and there's other work on finance as well that's ongoing. In terms of issues on adaptation, we are working on the global goal on adaptation together with our Egyptian colleagues. There'll be work progressing on that, and then additionally on issues such as loss and damage as well. There is a dialogue which will be started. So there are a whole range of commitments that we have got from parties, and we want to ensure that those commitments are being met.
From your experience as President in this past year, working with a predecessor President, do you feel that you'll continue to have authority to be able to drive through change with everybody knowing that your period of office is running down?
Well, I think we have to be very sensitive to the fact that there is a new presidency designate, and I've had a very good working relationships with ministers in the Egyptian government during our COP presidency designate, and we will work very closely with them. But of course, there is an expectation, actually not just from developing countries, but also from developed countries, that the UK then delivers what I would describe as a full-fat presidency year and works on the commitments. And of course, we will do that together with the Egyptians. And I think, as the Prime Minister said at the Liaison Committee on the 17th of November, the COP28 will be held in the UAE, so we will work with those partners as well.
In the sort of final moments of Glasgow, there was obviously some disappointment from some backtracking from China and India in particular. What would you regard as the biggest bits of unfinished business from Glasgow that you'd like to try to put right next year?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think in a way the work has started. Yes, I do think what we got over the line was historic. For the first time, countries agreed to come back within a year to look at their emission reduction targets. We've got a whole range of other commitments on finance and adaptation. But in those final hours of the COP, obviously there was an issue around the language on coal and fossil fuel subsidies. I would say that this is the first time at any COP that we have managed to get language on coal into the cover decisions. And if you recall, Chair, we didn't get this either at the G20 ministerial meeting in July in Naples that I attended, or indeed at G20 leaders, where there were commitments on international coal financing, but not domestic coal. So we are going to hold countries to account on those particular commitments that have been made.
Thank you. And as regards to the UK government coming together to support your efforts, do you think that you'll be able to maintain the same degree of coordination and resource from the UK government to continue to drive this agenda forward, both internationally and domestically?
Well, I very much hope so. And I think in terms of, I can talk to you very specifically in terms of numbers. So the COP unit in steady state was around 220 staff. We had a surge, obviously, as we got into the final 2 weeks of COP. Folks from other departments came in, but we also had departments working on each of the theme days that we had, so whether it was transport or energy or gender. Having looked at all of this, I think our view is that to be able to deliver on the commitments that we have obtained, we probably need to be around strength of around 140, 150 people in the COP unit going forward. We also had, of course, excellent support from the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office has around 460 climate attaches. They won't be doing just climate full time, but I think that was very valuable. And given that in the integrated review, tackling climate change and biodiversity loss is a top international priority, of course we'll continue to work with the FCDO.
Next year, Germany takes over presidency of the G7 and Indonesia the G20. Are you engaged with them to make sure that climate remains high on their agendas?
Yeah, absolutely. We are engaged with them, and in fact, I had a conversation with colleagues in the German government last week. We have a good working relationship with Indonesia, and of course the Italians will be handing over to them. And you're absolutely right. What we will want to see is climate reflected, as is, in fact, it has been during our G7 presidency as well, through the next G7 presidency, through the G20, through CHOGM as another example. I think if we have that green thread running through the year, there will be an opportunity for us to work on ensuring that the commitments that countries have given are also delivered.
Thank you. We're going to keep quite a brisk pace of questioning up to get everything in before we have to go to vote. Helen Hayes.
Thank you very much, Chair. A key feature of the Glasgow Pact was the agreement that all countries would revisit and strengthen their nationally determined contributions ahead of COP27. How confident are you of achieving that?
Well, we're obviously going to have to work very hard in partnership with other countries on this. I mean, if I look at the statistics, at COP we had, or by COP26 we had around 153 countries which had enhanced NDCs. Many of those had emissions reductions compared to their previous NDCs. There were countries, for instance, the G20, like India and Brazil, which set out more ambitious emission reduction targets, but those have not yet, for 2030, been reported to the UNFCCC, so we will want to ensure that happens. There are countries which made sectoral commitments, which may not yet be reflected in their NDCs, and obviously we will request that countries put those in. And then there will be other nations that have NDCs which are aligned to the Paris temperature goal, but where further detailed information is needed in terms of either sector work or in terms of delivery. So I think there's a whole range of areas where we will be pushing individual governments. But the way that we delivered COP26 was not just through a solo effort from the UK. We worked with other like-minded partners around the world, and we will continue to do that.
And what is the role that you and your team will be playing on that process? What does the process look like? Are there reporting points? Are there opportunities to come together with the leaders of the states where there are issues of concern about progress? What does it look like between now and COP27?
Yeah, so there will of course be points between now and COP27 where there will be meetings that takes place of representative groups of countries to push these issues forward. As I did during this year, I will do further bilateral engagement, including visits to some of the key countries, particularly in the G20, of course, recognizing the G20 represents 80% of emissions. There are mechanisms in place. So we also agreed at COP that there will be an annual synthesis report on the NDCs. That will be set out in 2027, so we'll be able to see how countries are getting on. And we also agreed a transparency framework as well. Once that is in place, countries will, of course, have to report on the actions that they're taking, and we'll be able to judge them against the commitments that they've made.
And how are you seeking to scrutinise the action behind the words? How confident can you be that commitments that are made are genuinely being delivered?
Well, I think this is a really important element of what we achieved at COP. For 6 years, collectively the world had been trying to close off the Paris Agreement, and one of the key outstanding elements was a framework on transparency where every government, every country reports on the same metrics in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of support that developed countries are providing to developing countries and the like. And we now have agreement on that. There are common tables, about 80 pages of tables which countries will have to fill in. This mechanism will be in place from 2024, but already you have governments that do report on their emissions reductions. So what we will be able to see is a standardised metric whereby we can assess whether commitments are being made. Chair, I may invite Alison, perhaps, if there's any more you want to say on this particular point.
Yeah, just to emphasise the point that it is the first time all 197 parties do actually have to report on their emissions, and as the COP President said, a huge amount of work went into that. There's 60 tables for reporting on greenhouse gas inventories. There's 13 tables for all countries have to fill out to track progress on their NDCs, and there's 13 tables to also report on the support that's been provided and received by developing countries. So this new reporting framework that's been agreed is significant and will allow the international community to keep track of progress.
Thank you, Helen. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Chair. In its recommendations following COP26, the Climate Change Committee suggested that the UK should focus on strengthening delivery of its existing NDC rather than actually improving the target per se. What do you think that says about the committee's confidence in the government's current ability to deliver on its pledges?
Well, I think I mean that report has come out in the last few days, and we're having a detailed look at this. And obviously, certainly from my perspective, I think the CCC provides very good independent challenge for government. Obviously, the CCC has recognised that the NDC that we have is aligned to the Paris goals, which is good news. And in fact, they've also recognised that the net zero strategy that was set out is something that is positive, which is an international benchmark. But I mean, delivery is an issue, I think, for absolutely every single country. And I think that's the point with the mechanisms that we've agreed, is that we can now track delivery and in the same way as that we ask others to push forward in delivery. Obviously, that's something that the UK continues to need to do as well.
You mentioned the net zero strategy, and alongside that, there is a spreadsheet showing how much each different measure in that net zero strategy will cut emissions by. And yet, the government isn't willing to release that spreadsheet. Could you cast any light on why that should be the case? Because obviously, people who are scrutinising the government's ability to fulfil its net zero strategy would like to see the individual emission reduction estimates alongside each of the different measures.
I think, forgive me, I think there are some ranges in there.
There's actually a document,
Yeah.
a spreadsheet,
Yes.
which has not been published. There's been a freedom of information request made. It's been denied. It's been in the Times, The Independent, and elsewhere.
I'm happy to come back to you, indeed ask other ministerial colleagues who have direct responsibility for this to come back to you. But the only thing I would say is that in terms of the net zero strategy that has been put forward, I do think it's been acknowledged as being ambitious and comprehensive by the CCC, and I think they've talked about it marking a significant step forward for UK climate policy. I think that's something that we should all welcome.
Absolutely, and I do. I just think it would be really helpful if we could see how the government will deliver against the different elements of it, and in that respect it would be really helpful if you could chase up colleagues to see if they could facilitate the publication of that spreadsheet. In what areas do you think action is most urgently needed to secure delivery of the emission reductions that the government has promised?
I think perhaps I'll sort of just explain the architecture that we have in government for delivery. So we obviously have a Climate Action Strategy Committee, which the Prime Minister chairs, that was set up in 2019, end of 2019, when we had the new Prime Minister coming in. And then we have a Climate Action Implementation Committee, which is the one that I chair. That is the committee where we have been coordinating the work on individual policies across government. And in fact, the net zero strategy came as a result of the coordinated work that was done in that committee. In terms of specific delivery, the government has a separate government priorities delivery committee, which the Prime Minister chairs, and that looks at all of the government's top priorities, one of which, of course, is net zero.
Could I just stop you? Only
Yes,
because I know colleagues are going to come and try
Sure.
and explore the issue between those two different committees in a moment. But I was hoping to get from you specific areas, whether that's agriculture or whether it's fossil fuel subsidies or whatever it might be, in terms of where you think action is most urgently needed to secure delivery.
Well, I think we need to take action across all of the elements of the 10-point plan that was set out last December. I mean, that was something I was very closely involved with when I was Base Secretary of State, and we set that out, and I think you can see the tracking on some of the outcomes from what we said we would do as part of that 10-point plan in terms of additional investment coming into the UK, in terms of announcing our transport decarbonisation strategy. We promised a net zero strategy that has now come forward as well. So I think you can see what has been delivered against that plan. But to the general point, clearly we need to make progress across all sectors.
We do, and it's not meant to be a difficult question. It's just genuinely asking that in some areas, like the power sector, obviously we've got much further ahead than in some other areas. And all I'm trying to understand is if you were to identify some of the key areas where you think more work is needed, so that we could get more ambition delivered, whether you would identify some of those.
Well, so, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be obtuse, but rather than singling any one sector out, I mean, the reality is that we're going to need to make progress against all of this. So whether it's the transport sector, as you know, there's a lot of work done on that. The Department of Transport is leading on that. And in terms of the power sector, We now have a commitment to quadruple the amount of offshore wind by 2030.
We don't need to worry quite so much about the power
No, I
sector,
understand that, but sorry, again, I'm not trying to be sort of difficult in answering this, just to make the point that I think there are strategies now in place across all of these departments which are responsible for the 10-point plan, and it is delivery of that that is being tracked by government, by the number 10 delivery unit.
Well, if I could just follow up very briefly, Chair. The assessment from the Climate Change Committee that was published last week identifies a number of areas where it thinks that more action is urgently needed, one of which is agriculture and land use, which is obviously 10% of emissions or more, and another was around behaviour change. And under that heading, they had things like diet or indeed reductions in the growth of aviation. Again, to go back to issues of transparency, there was a report that was published at the same time as the net zero strategy, but that was then withdrawn, which was about behaviour change. And for people who managed to see the report before it was taken off the website, it did talk about things like changing diet. Do you have any plans? Are there any plans to publish that report on behaviour change, which the CCC has said is an area that needs more attention?
I'm not aware of any such plans.
You're not aware of the document?
No, well, I obviously read the same reports as you did in the media on this. I think that wasn't a official government document, as I understand. It was a sort of thought paper or whatever it was. But no, as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to publish that.
Are there any plans in particular on behaviour change more broadly that you're aware of that you can share?
No, not particularly. I mean, what I would say is that I think this issue of diet, etc., has come up, and I think the view that the government has taken, and actually it's the view that I have as well on a sort of personal level, is that ultimately we shouldn't be effectively forcing people to go in a particular direction. Well, I mean, I believe much more in sort of carrot rather than stick, and so what you need to do is to provide incentives for individuals, as in fact we have done through elements like the grants to allow people to buy ultra-low emission vehicles, as an example. So I don't think the policy of this government is to force people down a particular route.
I'm not sure I was suggesting they should be forced, but it is interesting that in that report it did explicitly say that nudging is not enough. I suppose the very last point is just to say that we've identified a number of areas where clearly you don't necessarily have direct control in terms of delivery. How confident are you that on that wide range of issues of the 10-point plan and so forth, that you will have influence in terms of making sure those things get delivered?
Well, I think, obviously there will be influence through the Climate Action Implementation Committee, but ultimately the delivery of that, the responsibility of that is down to individual departments, and the delivery of net zero overall sits with the business department.
Thank you, Caroline. Just picking up on Caroline's the point where you were headed with structure of government. John McNally has some questions about your role.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, following on from Alok, there's your responsibilities as member of the Cabinet, including chairing the Committee on Climate Action Implementation, which considers net zero, building United Kingdom's resilience to the climate impacts. Can you just explain a bit more than how you're taking forward your responsibility as chair of this Cabinet Committee? Because I believe there are children who will be watching this, and I have been on plenty climate change question and answer sessions lately. They're deeply concerned about the way of the future, and I know you are yourself deeply concerned, and they'll be watching this, particularly on the you try to get the fossil fuel things over the line. I'm just wondering how you're going to embrace that in the Cabinet, and how you're going to make your position so strong that it cannot be refused.
So I think I described this. There are two elements to this committee. So one is driving forward the domestic policy agenda, working with other government departments. The other is, of course, the international work that we've been doing in relation to COP, and that we will continue to do during the coming year. So, for instance, we have set up a grouping called the Zero Emissions Vehicle Transition Council, which has sitting on it ministers representing, I think, around 50% of the global car market. That is something that is co-chaired between the Transport Secretary and myself, and discussions on that will take place at CAI on issues around nature. There will be discussions around that and sustainable land use, on energy transition. So I think there are two elements to it. One is, of course, driving the policy agenda domestically. The other is the international work that we are also doing as part of our COP responsibilities.
So how does the committee's work relate to that of the Climate Action Strategy Committee?
Yeah, so the Climate Action Strategy Committee is obviously, that's chaired by the Prime Minister, and that sets the overall framework of what we are doing and aiming to deliver as part of net zero. As the name implies, the aim of the implementation committee is then to push forward to ensure that we have policies which are then able to deliver on those top line commitments.
So the structure is there for assuming that everything that you will say, and then it will assure that implementation across government, so there'll be an all party, different factions within the government agreement and what your committee decides that will take this forward. I mean, it's been suggested many times that you probably not just cross-government, but you need cross-party agreement probably for the next 25, 30 years, so that there's going to be some sort of binding agreement that everyone adheres to. How do you feel about that?
Well, we have a binding agreement in the sense that we have net zero by 2050 in legislation. We have carbon budgets which are put into legislation. So that is what binds this government and future governments as well. I think it's worth pointing out also, Mr. McNally, that one of the roles that I've had is obviously to talk to governments around the world. And people have found it quite interesting, the way we have structured ourselves. I think they do find it something that works. And I think the fact that we have the Prime Minister sitting at the apex of this and actually directing this makes a big difference. And certainly I can tell you from conversations I've had with other governments around the world, they do see this as quite an interesting structure to perhaps adopt themselves.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John. And Robert Goodwill.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary of State. I'm not sure if I need to really ask this question given what you've already said, but just for the avoidance of doubt, the Climate Change Committee has declared that the net zero strategy needs to proceed at pace and warns that a change in ambition would risk to slowing the process of delivering our Paris commitments. Do you agree with that assessment? I think a simple yes or no would probably suffice.
I certainly agree that we need to go as fast as we possibly can. And I think in terms of carbon budgets, obviously we've met 1, 2, we're ahead on 3. We need to make further progress on carbon budgets 4, 5 and 6 in the future.
In terms of the domestic agenda and this cabinet committee that you're chairing, I'm just sort of trying to understand how you will operate. For example, will you be having a sort of a headmaster study type operation where you call in Grant Shapps and talk about aviation, or you get George Eustace to account for the amount of methane that agriculture is producing, or indeed get in Michael Gove and talk about our abysmal performance in terms of insulating our housing stock. Even Insulate Britain protesters haven't managed to insulate their own houses in some cases. So will you be sort of playing the bad cop in terms of getting them to commit their departments?
Well, we have a very egalitarian structure you would expect on this committee. I think the aim of the committee, and this is why I'm trying to make the distinction between what the CAS does and where the delivery responsibility sits, because I think the intention of the CAS is to pull together the policies that then need to be delivered. I can put it sort of in those terms. The delivery of this sits obviously with the Government Priorities Delivery Committee, with the number 10 delivery unit, and ultimately, of course, with individual departments.
I mean, we're all used to these sort of rag charts, the red, amber, green, and will you be operating something like that and ensuring that each department, for example, defence is probably quite a difficult department to deliver given that electric tanks haven't yet been really rolled out?
Well, and I think in terms of sort of the RAG rating of policies, I mean, that is something I'd expect individual governments would be doing, that would be something really for the delivery unit. But as I said, that is not the purpose of the CAI committee. That has been very much focused on ensuring that we have deliverable policies that we come up with. And I think the fact that we have a mechanism where all government departments at Secretary of State level are represented, I think does allow for us to ensure that there is a consistency in terms of the policies that we are coming up with, and precisely to avoid this issue where a policy in one department is made in independence to the other, and may find the two to be in conflict in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Well, in addition to the Environmental Audit Committee members, we have representatives from 5 other select committees who are now going to ask their questions. We're going to start with Sir Bernard Jenkin from the Liaison Committee.
Thank you. Can I first of all ask, following up the last 2 lines of questioning, you've had considerable resources at your disposal, Mr. President, in the run-up to COP. Are those resources going to remain at your disposal for the duration of your role?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Sir Bernard. I think, as I explained, what we've had in terms of resources is, in steady state, about 220 people in the COP unit. But what we have been able to do is obviously to call on other government departments in supporting our work. Obviously, around 70 to 80 of those individuals have been directly involved with the physical organisation of the COP itself. They obviously going forward, we will do other meetings, but obviously not on the same scale. My view is that in steady state, what we need is 140 to 150 people as part of the COP unit sitting in the Cabinet Office. Obviously, we will continue to lean on the Foreign Office for support, and other government departments for support as well. And with your permission, Chair, if I could invite perhaps Peter Hill, who's been doing a lot of the detailed thinking on this as well as CEO of COP, to perhaps give an overview of what is the optimal structure going forward.
Thank you, COP President. Yes, when you look at the number of commitments and number of work streams and the scale of the task to keep 1.5 alive, there's a lot of work to do in 2022. So I think many of the functions that we've had over the last 2 years...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you get a bit closer to your microphone because you're not coming through very loudly in the room?
Is that any better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
I'll start again, sorry. So I think if you look at the outcomes that we secured in Glasgow, the commitments we've made, and both the scale of the task to keep 1.5 alive, there's a great deal of work to be done in 2022. And so we think we need to keep, broadly speaking, similar capabilities to the ones that we've had. We're also very keen, as the COP President has said, to be able to rely on the FCDO network in order to help us deliver that. And a number of departments who you've probably heard from over the course of the last couple of years also have teams who've been supporting this. And I think it'd be important that they're also able to continue playing those roles. But the negotiating strand remains very significant. The finance strand will be a big part of what we need to do in 2022 to mobilise finance in support of what we're seeking to achieve. The campaigns, I think we're keen to keep going on coal, on transport, on nature. I could go through them, but I think when we look at the constituent elements of what we've done over the last 2 years, we don't think the job is done, and there's a huge amount more to do, and we need to keep broadly speaking, the capabilities that we've had in order to do that.
Okay, can I ask, does Archie Young stay on board as well?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Can we separate the sort of international dimension from the domestic dimension? Because I think most of the people around this table are more concerned about the historic failure of successive governments to live up to policies announced and targets set. And that, I mean, how much of that is a concern in the present situation, that we've got some very ambitious climate change targets, and we know the CCC is a little bit sceptical about the pace of delivery and the ability of the machinery of government to deliver.
Well, so Bernard, you're right. I mean, I think what Peter and I have been talking about is the delivery of the international commitments that we have obtained. in terms of the CAI committee, obviously there is a secretariat which I work with.
How big is the secretariat?
I'm sorry?
How big is the secretariat?
I think we've got a handful of people who are part of the secretariat sitting in the Cabinet Office, but they're obviously able to draw on policy resource from across individual government departments as well.
So what do we think we've learned from the recent experience where we've, for COVID purposes, we've had to rapidly develop cross-departmental programs and implement them very, very speedily. The vaccine task force, the test and trace operation. What do you think we've learned from that in terms of what we need to apply similar, almost emergency measures across government in order to drive things forward and to deliver?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the vaccines task force that obviously sat in the business department during last year. I think what we've learned is, of course, process is important as ever, but actually it is delivery that really matters, and you just need to have the whole thing being sort of driven forward. So I think it's interesting reflecting on what Kate Bingham has said in recent weeks about her experience of leading that task force. And ultimately, you can cut these things in very many ways. Different governments have different approaches to this. Ultimately, this is about delivery, exactly as you say, and increasing the pace of that. And that's what I think the architecture that the government has in place is hopes to do.
I wonder what your officials feel they have learnt in the run-up to COP about, and what their concerns are about, or what positive they can say that they think will give confidence to the public that our domestic programmes, that the promises we made at COP are actually going to be implemented.
I'll invite if any of the officials would.
Let me just say, I think this committee, or this group of committee chairs, would be very, very keen to give the government every support to strengthen its delivery. And if there's an open mind, we know the Prime Minister has complained about the levers of government being connected to bits of elastic and things not working terribly well. What discussions going on in the Cabinet Office about, for example, our civil nuclear programme, how to drive that forward with more confidence?
Well, I think, Sabina, in terms of the officials, obviously the officials you've got here have been primarily responsible for the international delivery of the COP. So maybe I can take this. Look, there is obviously a mechanism in place in terms of delivery, and the Prime Minister came. You obviously chaired the liaison committee, and the Prime Minister came and spoke at that, and some of these questions were raised on the 17th of November. The Prime Minister set out his views, and ultimately he is responsible for the architecture of government. You're all very experienced parliamentarians here, and if you sort of set out a view, I'm sure the government will have a look at it.
How should we, we're going to have more metrics questions in a moment, but how should we measure the success of the machinery of government and the culture of government at the centre, that it really is driving this? Or is it going to be left to the departments to fight it out amongst themselves, which is so often leads to paralysis?
So I think in terms of the sort of the parameters of what we're trying to achieve, obviously in the 10-point plan, it just does set out what the intention is across each of those 10 areas of government in terms of delivering net zero, and clearly that's the metric that the government will also be using in terms of what we've delivered. For instance, since we've sort of talked about the power sector, the aim is that we go from 11, 12 gigawatts now to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Clearly, that information is available. People can see what is going on, and they can also see what progress the government is making. But I think that, as an example, is something that is something that the government will want to track. We've talked about the fact that we want to have £90 billion of inward investment by 2030 in terms of delivering the net zero strategy. It is possible to see what are the commitments that are being made in terms of inward investment. I just picked those two as examples, but as I said, ultimately the responsibility for delivery of this is not something that is sitting with the CAI or indeed with the COP unit. That sits obviously as part of the delivery committee that the Prime Minister chairs and the number 10 delivery unit.
Right, that's a very important piece of information you've given us. But as COP President, who must be interested in seeing the United Kingdom deliver its own domestic COP goals, could you undertake to be the ambassador of this group of parliamentarians, that if we bring proposals to you which would accelerate confidence in the delivery of our COP goals, our domestic COP goals, you will promote them in the government? Because I think the Prime Minister's got an open mind on this sort of thing.
Well, as I said, Sabina, I'm very happy to see any recommendations that either this sort of overarching committee makes or individual committees make. But ultimately, as you'll appreciate, the decision on the architecture of government is down to the Prime Minister. Of course, on a personal level, I'm very happy to look at anything that comes forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Bernard. Just picking up on the comment you just made there, President, did the CAI have responsibility for coordinating the net zero strategy work, or was that done by the Cabinet Office Delivery Unit?
No, so the work on sort of pulling that together, looking at the individual strategies they came forward, that was done through the CAI process.
Thank you. And now on to to Darren Jones, the Chairman of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, Alok Sharma. The Climate Adaptation Implementation Committee is predominantly made up of officials, is that correct?
No, that is made up of ministers, so cabinet ministers, or if they're not able to attend, then obviously other ministers from their departments.
And the number 10 delivery unit?
The number 10 delivery unit is obviously officials, yeah.
Officials. The reason I ask is because access to officials and information from cabinet committees by select committees is quite difficult because of the osmothery rules and other issues. And so we need a responsible minister in order to come and give us the information. In terms of whole of government coordination for decarbonisation, is that responsible minister you or the business secretary?
So for the delivery of net zero, that is the BEIS Secretary of State. As indeed when I was BEIS Secretary of State, that was part of my responsibility, and obviously we have a new Secretary of State. That would be his responsibility.
Is that satisfactory?
Well, I mean, that is part of the sort of the architecture of government that we have, and I think a lot of the policies that are going to allow us to deliver net zero are, of course, originated in the business department and driven out of the business department. So, I think it's logical that that sort of net zero architecture sits within the business department.
I'm just highlighting what seems to be a bit of a muddle around central coordination through the Cabinet Office and reporting on that basis, and a department who should be a spoke, I suppose, from the hub of the Cabinet Office, who's actually the responsible minister for the whole of government. But thank you for that answer.
If I may, Mr. Jones, I mean, just to go back to this point about, and I think the Prime Minister was asked about this at the liaison committee, and I think he said, ultimately he was responsible for this in the sense that he does chair, well, he's a Prime Minister, but also he chairs the Government Priorities Delivery Committee as well, which looks at not just net zero, but of course, the other priority missions that the government has in terms of levelling up education, jobs and skills, health and care, and crime and justice.
Thank you. We've heard about the 14 tables in the UN's transparency framework for reporting purposes. It would be useful to understand the gap between our international reporting requirements and our domestic delivery promises. Can you commit to write to us to lay out what's in those 14 tables and how that might differ to our various policies at a UK level around delivery of our net zero targets?
If I may ask.
Yeah, and just to clarify that, as a developed country in the process, the UK has been reporting through its biannual reports for a number of years on these issues. So most of the requirements in those new tables that were agreed at COP26, we have been reporting on to the UNFCCC for a number of years, and that's part of the standard response that's run through BEIS as well.
But there is a gap, is there not, between our suite of policy announcements at a UK level in order to reach our net zero target and how we report on those compared to what we report to the UN, is the point I'm trying to get to. That's right, isn't it?
Well, we set out every year. I mean, again, this is sort of Bay's responsibility, but I think we do set out every year a report on emissions from a domestic perspective. I think what we're talking about in terms of under the UNFCCC framework, that is something that will be effective from 2024, and that is the enhanced transparency framework. So the software for allowing individual countries to report in and fill in the tables, that is currently being put together by the UNFCCC, and once that is available, all countries will be required to have the same consistent information, so we can see very clearly, you've made commitment A, have you actually delivered in terms of that commitment?
That won't go to the depth of saying, for example, looking at the transport decarbonisation strategy from the Department for Transport or the industrial decarbonisation strategy.
No, so I think that obviously will be separate in the sense that what the UNFCCC architecture will be doing will be looking at, actually something sort of very core in terms of, are you driving down your emissions? So it will have inventories for a number of gases across different sectors, and so that's the bit you will be able to then track on a consistent basis in terms of whether, when a country says they're going to reduce their emissions by X percentage by a certain point, they are actually doing so.
What I'm trying to understand is the depth of reporting for our purposes as Select Committee. So if maybe you could share that information with us about what you expect to see, not just what we've been reporting on in the past, but what was agreed at COP26 and what will be delivered by 2024, then we'll be able to see if there's gaps that we want to pursue further. And my last question is around international collaboration on parliamentary scrutiny. The UK, alongside other wealthy nations, made promises to other countries around the world at COP26, but they can't sit around this table and ask you or anybody else about when you'll deliver on those promises. So one of the things that I and others think we should do is build our international networks of sister committees and other scrutiny functions around the world to make sure that we're talking to each other, and we think that will be beneficial to holding governments around the world to their commitments at COP26. Is that something you would support?
So, I think just to sort of separate the two, I think what you're talking about, Mr. Jones, is, I suspect, an ongoing, work on a sort of international basis in terms of how parliamentarians work together across the world. I think what we already, though, have is existing architecture, and I think that has been enhanced as a result of agreeing the transparency framework, which will allow anyone to be able to see, once all of this data is provided, as to how individual countries are doing from the end of 2024. The other thing that we will see is a global stocktake that takes place in 2023, where countries will effectively be reporting against the three pillars of the Paris Agreement, so in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptation, in terms of finance, and at that point as well, we'll be able to see how countries are doing on the basis of that stocktake. So that architecture already exists. I think what you're talking about, and that may be a very powerful tool, what you're talking about is allowing this kind of interaction on a more international basis.
Yes, and my question is that something you would support?
Look, there is always a value in holding governments to account. So I'm not here sort of saying that isn't something, but all I'm saying to you is that, and by the way, my role as COP President goes on for, as you say, until Sharm el-Sheikh.
I'm asking you a question.
So there will be no more UK COP President after that. And so you may well think that that proposal is interesting going forward on an international basis. But I think for us, what's been very important is to make sure that the infrastructure is in place for reporting, which is what we now have.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. And now to the Chairman of the Science and Technology Committee, Greg Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. And COP President, congratulations to you and your team for what you achieved in Glasgow and the commitment that you made to it. Thinking about what was achieved there, one of the goals of the COP going into it was to secure global net zero by mid-century. Was that achieved, do you think?
Well, I think what we set out to achieve was to keep within sight the goal of limiting, or the goal of ensuring that we limit global warming by the end of the century to 1.5 degrees. And that is a reflection of the Paris Agreement goal, which is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5. In that respect, I think, I said at the time, and I think people, there are sort of independent parties who have also agreed to this, is that we have managed to keep 1.5 alive. I said in Glasgow that I think whilst we've managed to do that, the pulse is weak, and therefore we need to ensure that the commitments that countries have made are actually delivered. There are various reports that have come out showing where we've got to. I think if all the commitments that have been made are delivered on, then I think the trajectory is obviously below 2 degrees of global warming. But as with every COP, this is a staging post. We have made progress, I think significant progress at this COP actually. There will be
a particular objective to secure global net zero by mid-century. Post the COP, are we still on track for that?
So in terms of global net zero by mid-century, we have got to a point where 90% of global emissions are covered by net zero. When we started off this process around 2 years ago, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. So we have got to 90%, which I think is an achievement. But obviously, what we need to ensure that countries then deliver policies which allow them to meet that target.
So just on the policies, what proportion of the 90% of countries that have made commitments consistent with net zero by mid-century, what proportion is going to be achieved by the deployment of known technologies now, things like electric vehicles, versus looking to new breakthroughs, unknown technologies? How does that split up?
I can't give you a sort of a direct answer on that. Clearly, there are a significant number of technologies that already exist, which we need to ensure are deployed much more rapidly across the world. And I think you made reference to the breakthroughs. So we have the Glasgow breakthroughs, which have set this out in terms of how do we ensure that this is made available in a cost-effective way around the world. There will be additional technology that is being developed. We've got the various sort of mission innovation tasks that are going on a sort of international basis.
On existing technologies, on known technologies, if they were deployed, would that get us to where we need to be?
I think on if I rather than give you a sort of some sort of percentage answer, I would be very happy to write on the specific point. I think the point of the breakthroughs, and I'll invite Matt if he wants to come in and talk about this, is actually to look at the most polluting sectors, so and see what we can do to ensure that by 2030 we are seeing these technologies rapidly deployed. And these are technologies that are already very much in existence and are being deployed across the world, or these are technologies where there's a lot of funding going in terms of developing them. For instance, hydrogen being one. The power sector is another, where I've talked about the fact that the cost of renewables has come down significantly over the last 10 years.
So by mid-century, we're not needing to place great reliance on technologies that have yet to be discovered. The plan is to do it on existing known technologies rather than expecting that there will be new technologies that will take the strain in the later years.
Well, I think that they will, there are, Matt may want to come in on this, but there are a range of technologies that already exist. There are other nascent technologies that are emerging, and no doubt there will be technologies that we are not yet aware of, which emerge, which help us to get to that goal.
Which is whether they take us further than we were expecting.
Sure.
But perhaps you write to me on that. And just a couple of last questions, because we are pressed for time. In terms of the breakthroughs, you mentioned the breakthroughs, and there are these Glasgow breakthroughs, and the communiqué from the UK mentions 5 of them: power, road transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture, climate resilient, sustainable agriculture. Yet the COP summary of the challenges, of the breakthroughs, doesn't include agriculture. Why is that? Has it been adopted by the whole COP? Is the agriculture breakthrough part of the suite, or is this just a UK preference?
Happy to come in on this. So there were 5 breakthroughs that were agreed to, absolutely right, at COP by the 40 leaders who came together as part of that agreement, and they cover the 5 areas that you described. Including agriculture.
So it's just a mistake on
For 4 of them, the process was set out by which over the coming year and then on an annual basis there would be a checkpoint process, a review of how the progress was going against delivery of those objectives. So for the 4 excluding agriculture, a process involving the International Energy Agency, IRENA, high-level champions, and others would do a report each year. Ministers would convene each year. There will be the first of those in September next year in Pittsburgh. The SEN-MI ministerial will be the point for looking at progress. On the 5th, as you said, agriculture, we said as presidency that we would set out plans during the course of this year for how we will follow a similar process.
Why wasn't it possible to agree that at Glasgow, just like the other ones?
So the agriculture discussion involved talking to a broad range of different parties who are involved in sustainable agriculture and agriculture tradition, and they involve a different group of organisations essentially.
So that's business for the remainder of the presidency to sort out the delivery of the agriculture breakthrough.
The commitment is to work with parties during the course of next year to then identify the way forward for that.
And President, do you accept that as being one of the things you want to achieve by the end of your presidency, to have agriculture with a plan to match the others?
Yes, I mean, that's clearly what we want to do, yes.
Excellent, thank you. And finally for me, there is, in these breakthroughs, a commitment that the new technologies should be affordable and accessible for all. Can you just say something about how you can assure yourself and therefore everyone else that the technologies that are discovered will not be prohibitive on the bills of consumers and others?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm going back to the sort of the clean power sector as an example. One of the things that we did see at this COP was a number of announcements in terms of supporting developing economies. So there was a clean energy transition a plan that was announced for South Africa with $8.5 billion from international partners going in to support them as part of that move from coal to clean power. We also had the Global Energy Alliance, which was a grouping of philanthropies and countries as well, but philanthropies, people like sort of Bezos and Rockefeller, putting up $10 billion. The aim is to mobilize $100 billion by 2030. And I think the intention is to support developing countries through finance, both public and private sector, in terms of making the transition to, in this instance, to clean energy, to renewables. And I think that has to be part of the answer, is that if you look at countries, the commitments that they've set out in terms of cutting emissions, some of it does rely on financial support. We had this plan to mobilize $100 billion, which is a significant amount of money. But the reality is that we know for a clean energy transition, for instance, that it's going to require several $1 trillion a year across the world. And this is where the private sector has a big role to play.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. And now from the Transport Committee, Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, what progress do you expect to make under your presidency for the rest of the year towards delivering the COP26 pledge on accelerating the transition to 100% net emissions for surface transport? You've mentioned briefly the transition to zero-emission vehicles, but we can't transition without considering active travel and public transport. Because they actually deliver, according to the Climate Change Committee, emission cuts sooner than zero-emission vehicles will. So, what's your hopes for the next year?
So, if I may just understand the question, you're talking about what we might do domestically in terms of active travel?
In terms of your presidency on on zero emission surface transport? I mean, cars and vehicles are zero emission vehicles are obviously a key part of that, and I'm aware of that there was an agreement on that.
And that has been the key driver for us. I mean, if you look at emissions from transport, a very significant percentage of those are obviously from road transport, and that's why we have driven forward commitments from countries to ensure that they phase out the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles and have only new sales of new ultra-low emission vehicles from a certain date. I mean, the UK itself has been very clear that from 2030 we will only have the sale, new cars will be ultra-low emission vehicles, in the same way that at COP26 I think we had countries representing around a third of the global car market, which made commitments in this respect. We had some of the biggest car manufacturers, people like GM, JLR, Ford, etc., who also made commitments on this. So I think that has been one of the key drivers of what we've been doing actually also the past 18 months through our Zero Emissions Vehicles Transition Council.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, obviously, being on Transport Committee, we're aware of what the UK has been doing domestically on zero emission and low emission public transport and encouraging active travel and so on. Is any of that feeding into your international work?
Yes, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think the key feature, and I mean, Matt, if you want to sort of comment on from a campaign side, but a key feature of our work on the transport sector has been on zero emission vehicles going forward, and I think that has gathered pace. And obviously at COP itself, we had countries signing up to ensuring that in future they will only have sales of, or when it comes to new cars, sale of ultra low emission vehicles. And I think with all of these type of agreements that are reached, they are sort of living agreements, if I can put it like that. I mean, you build on those. So during this year, we will see whether we can get other countries committed in the same way. And you've seen this, for instance, when it comes to the phase out of coal. That is something that has been built on over a number of years, and we now have a significant number of countries which have signed up on that particular issue. But I know from a campaign's point of view, is there anything more you want to say, Matt?
Yeah, just to add that, I mean, we started the presidency with very few countries having made a commitment to phasing out their internal combustion engines, and the UK's position allowed the UK to then play a leading role internationally, and that led to, at COP26, this commitment to phasing out internal combustion engine by 2035 in leading markets by 39 countries, which is a huge kind of change.
It's all this. It's just focused on the private car, not on buses or trains or other forms of transport.
That campaign specifically is focused on cars, private cars. Yeah.
Okay. And now moving on to aviation, which obviously is one of the hardest sectors to decarbonise, and also has significant other climate impacts beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. So in respect of global negotiations, where do you think the focus is likely to be? Is it going to be on demand management and airport expansion, on airlines being responsible for their own emissions, or is it just going to focus on zero carbon fuels and zero carbon technologies?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to state is that there was obviously an ongoing debate about whether or not the UK should include its international aviation and maritime emissions in our carbon budgets. That's something that we decided to do. I think that's been welcomed by many people who want to see us cutting our emissions. And in respect of that, one of the things that we have done at COP itself was we launched a coalition, about over 20 countries that have signed up to this, representing around I think half of the world's aviation emissions, and pushing for an agreement to do an international agreement to ensure that we have emissions coming down on a sort of global basis. And now you'll be aware that the International Civil Aviation Organization is the key body for this. That has its meeting next autumn, and I think one of the things we want to do is to push forward on that and see whether we can get commitments from further countries at that particular meeting. But is there anything you want to add on this particular issue, Matt? No?
Not particularly.
Okay, fine.
So can I just clarify, because all the UK focus has been on zero carbon fuels and technologies, and not on any of the other aspects. So I assume that's going to be reflected in your work internationally as well.
Well, so I mean, obviously the issue of ICAO, that will sit with the Transport Department, obviously with the Transport Secretary, who will be responsible for that. In terms of what the government has been doing on a more domestic basis, as you know, it has invested in sustainable aviation fuels. I think, if memory serves me correctly, about £180 million has been invested in that. There is the Jet Zero program that is running, which is a joint piece of work between the Department for Business and the Transport Department. So there are a number of things that are going on domestically in terms of pushing forward, and ultimately it's up to every individual country to decide how they want to see a cut in emissions. What I think we are driving for is an agreement internationally that aviation emissions is something that we should be looking to drive down.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ruth. And then the Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride.
Thank you very much for that. Welcome, Alok. Can I just ask you about finance? Peter Hill recognised earlier in one of his responses, I think, that next year a major focus for you is going to be on how do you mobilise vast quantities of private capital to drive forward to net zero. It's not going to be governments alone that do this. And I attended an excellent session actually with Mark Carney at COP26, where he spoke about the GFANS group, which on the first face of it looks impressive. 450 institutions, 45 countries, 130 trillion of assets there. How confident, though, are you that we're going to be able to align those assets with these climate change goals, particularly given obviously that a lot of those institutions are heavily invested, for example, in hydrocarbons?
So I think in terms of GFANS, as you say, it's $130 trillion worth of assets, and a quarter of all financial assets in the world. And to sign up to this, to become a GFANS member, I mean, you are required to set out robust, independently verified science-based targets to decarbonise. And I think in the first instance by 2025 or 2030, and you are required to do that within 12 to 18 months of joining GFANS. I think about 90 of the 450 institutions have already done so, and there is a requirement that these targets are going to be have to be reviewed every 5 years. They have to be reported on annually, and obviously, if people are not keeping up to their commitments, they no longer get to participate in GFANS. I think for me, and I mean, Matt, who's been working very directly with Mark Carney's team on this, may want to comment, but I think the issue for me is, I think it's great that we have this commitment of $130 trillion. The issue is, how do you connect this with developing countries who actually need the finance in the first place? So there are a number of strands of work that are going off GFANS. One of them, Track 7, is looking at precisely this, is that how do you use this funding to mobilize money to support projects in developing countries, and the CEO of Macquarie Bank is leading on this. And I think some of the issues that they're looking at as well is that how do you work on blended finance, how do you work with multilateral development banks, whether there is a scope for first loss instruments to be set up by multilateral organizations as well, to ensure that on the back of that, the private sector will invest as well. So that for me has been the key thing, is that I think it's great to get these commitments. I very much welcome them. The question is, how do you connect that? But on your specific point about GFANS and ensuring that the people are doing what they're committed to. Matt, do you want to just comment?
Yeah, very happy to. So, as COP President said, any firm that wants to join the GFANZ initiative has to do it through one of the different kind of member coalitions that oversee the different sections of the financial services industry, so whether insurance, asset owners, asset managers. But they need to satisfy the criteria for the UN-backed Race to Zero campaign. So all of these 450 companies need to satisfy those commitments. And that means making a mid-century net zero commitment, making a 2030 commitment that's consistent with the IPCC's 1.5 degree report pathway. As the COP President said, annual reporting against this. And so there's a set of consistent, clear benchmarks that these organisations will need to sign up to and
Although
commit
it's quite
to.
difficult, isn't it, to attain a lot of clarity around benchmarks in this kind of area. So how do you keep their feet to the fire? How do you make sure there's not greenwashing, for instance, which has been one of the great criticisms of what's happened in the UK financial markets and the role of the FCA, is that in a sense there's an incentive just to kind of pretend that you're doing this stuff, but you're not really aligning those incentives.
I mean, I agree that that's a risk, and that's why the annual public reporting is a critical part of it. So any organisation which has signed up to a GFANZ commitment but is not reporting, or reports that it is not on target to meet its commitments, should then be, its membership should be reviewed by the coalition that controls.
How do you know you've got
that.
the right targets, the right metrics, the right way of measuring these institutions and what they're actually doing?
So that's where pegging this back to the IPCC 1.5 degree trajectories is what's important for it, and that applies to the wider Race to Zero methodology. And it's one where there are expert groups that input to the trajectories that firms need to test their alignment with. And so it's drawing on the network of independent experts that can assure that they are publishing consistent plans with those IPCC reports.
Is greenwashing a concern? Is it high up on your agenda when you look at this area?
So I think it's really important that the commitments that companies make are robust, that they're credible, and they're high integrity, and that's why you need very high standards as set out by the Race to Zero, internationally benchmarked campaign. But it is important that you have high integrity and that there is public reporting against those commitments.
Just to add that obviously there is a general point around greenwashing, and I think there will be various organisations, NGOs, who will want to, as indeed we all will, want to ensure that when commitments are made, they are not greenwashing. And you'll be aware that the Secretary General, actually, in his speech, the World Leaders Summit, set out, his own plan for having a high-level expert group to look at, net zero commitments from non-state actors. And I think, when this group is up and running, it will look at, what are the existing standards, what are the existing accountability measures, whether they are fit for purpose, how can you better translate all of this into international processes. So that is something, that's a piece of work that the Secretary General has obviously decided to initiate. And I think the intention is that this group will be up and running from the beginning of the year, and potentially even by this autumn put out some sort of early report on some of these issues.
Right, thank you. I think it's something our committee will probably look at quite closely, but thank you very much. The final question, because I know a vote is very imminent, but getting back to government funding and this 100 billion per year commitment, which has moved out to 2023, but maybe hopefully we can bring it back to 2022. What is it that gives you confidence that you might be able to shift it a little bit nearer to the present?
So I think the first thing is that those numbers that went into the delivery plan were obviously obtained by the OECD, verified by them. And if you look at the analysis that the OECD did, it also had well, firstly, they took out any kind of double counting. They had a pretty conservative multiple in terms of private sector mobilization of the back of public money. And we also had a number of announcements, for instance, from Japan in terms of additional finance. So we'll have to see whether additional commitments are made by governments during 2022 in terms of supporting developing economies. But I think it will provide actually quite a lot more confidence into the system if we are able to say, that this 100 billion has been mobilized by the end of 2022.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mel. And just before we wrap up, we've had your lead negotiator present on the screen, but hasn't yet said anything. I'd just like to ask you, Archie Young, if you could give us very concisely your biggest disappointment and your biggest satisfaction from the negotiations that you were leading.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I think the greatest satisfaction when I look at what was achieved was that we set out with a clear plan, which was based on the feedback from other countries as to what they expected COP26 to deliver, and based on the 2 years worth of mandates that were set for us. And across the board, we achieved what we set out to achieve. Now, inevitably in a multilateral negotiation, it's the old adage that not everybody gets everything that they want. But everybody came away with something, and everybody, I think, is very clear on the path ahead. And that's really where we need to focus now, is on the tasks that await us. I think rather than disappointment, I'd really point to just the sheer scale of the task that we still have to do. Countries still need to come back and come forward with more ambitious targets, and we need to continue to accelerate action on finance, on adaptation, on loss and damage, and across the piece. So I think that's certainly the spirit in which I look at it now.
Thank you very much indeed. You can probably hear the bell, so we're being summoned to vote. I'll draw the session to a close. I'd just like to do so by thanking Alok Sharma, COP26 President, and his team, Peter Hill, the Chief Executive, Archie Young, the lead negotiator, Alison Campbell, the Deputy Negotiator, and Matt Toombs for joining us today. Order, order. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you in the spring.
Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room. 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 Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room.